Boldwood presents Finding Friends on Beamer Street, written by Sheila Riley and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Cashel, Ireland, July 1921. Shaving on a Friday. Are you in court, Paddy? Christy Redfern focused on his twin brother with blurry, beer-soaked eyes and gave a mirthless laugh. "You know your own tricks best, Red," answered Paddy, soaping his chin. "I am in no humour for you today." "For sure." Red shrugged his shoulders and scowled, his head thumping. He could well do without Paddy's pontificating. Older by just half an hour, Paddy never failed to remind him by word or deed that he was the chosen one. Ever eager to show him the error of his ways, Red thought of the trips he made to Liverpool, when he could do whatever he liked, away from Paddy's scrutiny and constant nagging. "Have you fed the pigs?" Paddy's reflection glared through the rust-speckled mirror. "It's done," Red replied with a definite nod of his head. "Well, it will be when I get my head on straight. What a blinding night that was." "What time did you get in?" Here we go again. Red sighed deeply, unable to recall the exact time, maybe around dawn. "Not late." Red was desperate to put his head on the pillow and sleep. "Depending on how you look at it, I was home very early, but not on the same day I went out." He decided not to share this information with Paddy. He looked as happy as a man going to the gallows. Still drunk, the thought made Red want to giggle. Nevertheless, St. Paddy would not approve, so he remained as straight-faced as he could. Paddy was an idiot, working all the hours sent. He was good for a few bob, though, when times were hard and friends were few. "It's about time you pulled your weight, Red. It won't always be here." "I don't know why you put so much work into the place. It isn't even ours." "No, the farm isn't ours, but it could be," Paddy answered through the mirror. "Sure, why would I be after breaking my back for such little reward, when I can tap a mug like you? Instead of drinking every penny, you could save up, like me. Well, seeing as you're so flush, could you see your way clear to—" His head bobbed like a cork on water, his hazy eyes wide and expectant. "I'm not lending you another penny." Paddy cut his brother's begging request mid-sentence. Ever since they were born, Red had depended on his twins' generous nature. Red scowled, pulling down the peak of the cap he had worn from the night before, his corduroy trousers and shirt crumpled. He had missed some badly needed sleep, rehearsing what he would say to Paddy, to whom he had conveniently forgotten he still owed money. His refusal was like a smack in the kisser for sure. "Come on, Paddy, it's only for a few days." He tried not to sound desperate as he eyed the determined jut of Paddy's jaw through the mirror. Slowly, tantalisingly, Paddy drew a long streak of soap and stubble from the side of his face with an open razor, saying nothing, building up Red's hope. "Sure, you get it back by next Friday. It's only a loan. 7 measly days." Red tugged the cotton loops on the blue candlewick bedspread until there was a bald patch. "I'll even pay you interest. How's that?" "That's good of you," Paddy said ruefully, dimming Red's hopes. Sitting on the end of the double bed he shared with his twin brother, Red was silent as his foot impatiently tapped the bare floorboards. It would not do to rush Paddy into a decision. He liked his bit of power, and Red was usually happy to oblige. But today he was in a hurry. He had to pay Dinny O'Mara. Although he knew if he sounded anxious, Paddy would make him wait until the very last minute before giving him the money he so desperately needed. "The last minute is here, Paddy, and you are my only chance of staying attached to my kneecaps." "You want to buck your ideas up," Paddy said, through a face half full of lava. "I'll keep it in mind, Father Christmas." Red's thoughts were as sour as the taste in his mouth. He did not voice his thoughts, obviously. Instead, he went for a repentant expression, nodding his head in all the right places. "I know, you're right, Paddy, and I will." "You've got to get a grip of yourself. Lay off the drink," Paddy told him. "Come in at a respectable hour and stay away from the rebels." "This'll be the last time, Paddy, honest to God." He wanted to knock Paddy's patronising block off so much. "You say that every time." "For Jesus' sake, will you leave me with a bit of dignity?" Red raked stubby fingers through thick black hair. "Do you want me to get down on bended knees, do you?" Red knew he had to keep his paper dry. Once he had the money, he could tell Paddy exactly what he thought. But until then, he would have to play the penitent, apologetic game. "Well, you're out of luck this time, Red. I am sorry." "What?" A small explosion went off inside Red's head. He checked it. Paddy was serious. Red glared at his brother through the mirror, leaning over the washbowl. Paddy's expression was one of determined concentration. An expression that told Red he had closed the subject. It was over, done with. Red felt the anger swell inside him, his temples throbbing. He had to sit here and listen to Paddy spouting rubbish about him saving for a future, and the bastard wasn't going to lend him the money after all. "There's no end to it, Red," Paddy said, waggling his razor in the water to remove the thick white suds. "My money feels like it's on an elastic band, back and forth. I'm losing track." You were loving this. Red knew he could not blow. Paddy might just change his mind. He tried another tack. "I wouldn't ask, Pad, but you see," Red would play on his brother's protective nature, "I owe Dinny O'Mara, and he wants his money today." "Then he will have to want," Paddy said, calm as you like, "because I haven't got it to lend you." He turned his cheek and slid the open razor down the other side. "Come on, Paddy, you know as well as I do, O'Mara's not a man you can say no to." Red glared at the back of his brother's head. Paddy wouldn't deny him now, surely. "That's a pity, Red, but I have not got the money." "What do you mean you haven't got it? You're loaded." Red swallowed the volcanic anger rising inside of him. Paddy was being awkward. He wondered if he should mention what he saw his twin brother and Mary Jane Starling doing in the hayloft. He decided against it and would drop that bombshell only if matters got desperate and Paddy dug his size 12s in. "I was loaded, Red, but that was before." "Before what?" Red's curiosity tempered the rising anger he found hard to quell. "Before I bought a couple of boat tickets and decided to go to church." Paddy looked smug as he continued shaving. "I hope you'll say one for me while you're there." If Dinny O'Mara got hold of him, he was going to need all the prayers he could get. "I'm not going to Mass. I went to the early one this morning." Paddy's voice held a note of admonishment, "but you wouldn't know that because you weren't home." "So why are you going?" Red ignored the slight, but he knew confession was not until tomorrow. "Because, brother, I'm getting married." So that's what the boat tickets were for, a honeymoon. "Mary Jane?" A name came out like a gasp of air. Through the looking glass, Paddy stretched his neck, pressing soapy lips together while making little upward swipes to his chin with the lethal-looking razor. "Jesus!" Red's voice was hangover hoarse. He could not believe it. "Mary Jane!" Slowly he shook his head. "Just a quiet ceremony." "I'm happy for you." "You bastard." Mary Jane was the most beautiful girl in all of Cashel, if not the whole of Ireland. Did Paddy have any more grenades to throw? First the money, then Mary Jane? The girl he had set his sights on years ago. "When are you going to marry her?" "Half an hour," Paddy answered succinctly. "I want you to be my best man." "Are you mad?" Red could not keep the astonishment from his voice. "Do her brothers know?" Mary Jane had 3 older, very protective, well-respected brothers who would not take kindly to losing the only woman of the house. Watching Paddy finish his shave, softly whistling as he dried his cutthroat razor on the towel around his neck, Red knew Paddy was taunting him. The low, arrogant whistle told Red he was the loser. However, he wouldn't be if he opened his mouth, would he? Red knew what they had been getting up to. He had followed them into the barn, and what he saw had confirmed his suspicions. Nevertheless, from that moment on, he knew no peace. Thoughts of Mary Jane tormented him day and night. In his dreams, it was not Paddy enjoying her soft, silken flesh and seductive curves. Mary Jane was not making passionate love to his brother, she was with him. The dreams were driving him mad, goading him, tormenting him, reminding him he was second best. Why else would he drink strong beer and whiskey every night? It was all Paddy's fault. Once again, Paddy had landed on his feet. Paddy, his father's golden boy, the chosen one, the second bloody coming of Christ. Too slow to get out of your own road. Paddy's words rang in his head. Not like your brother, the firstborn, Da had said more than once. Paddy was akin to royalty in their parents' eyes. Have you told Da? This he had to see. Their father would go berserk. His eldest son marrying on the quiet. He would want the biggest of hoolies for Paddy. Red suspected the uncontrollable rage that made grown men scatter was the only thing he would ever inherit from Da. I'm not telling him. Paddy shook his head, taking great care to straighten the grey tie over his good white shirt, a new one. Let's get it over with. Paddy hoisted his charcoal-coloured jacket off the hook behind the bedroom door. When he turned to face him, Red was sure he could see doubt in his brother's eyes. You want me to stand for you? You won't even lend me the money to get O'Mara off my back. Red could not believe the arrogance of his twin brother. Be told, will ye? Paddy flung the words over his shoulder as Red followed him. The pounding in his head was getting louder. Why didn't she tell her brothers about the marriage? Red asked, as they headed down a narrow path that sliced through the barley fields towards St. Helen's Church. They'd kill her, and me. Paddy's dark eyes were hooded, and he took a deep breath. But she'll have nothing to fear when we move to Liverpool. Red stopped. They weren't coming back? The news hit him like a runaway stallion and took the wind right out of him. He couldn't breathe. Paddy was taking Mary Jane away. What about the farm? He gasped. Surely Paddy wasn't expecting him to tend it. We'll be back in a couple of years, maybe. We've got no choice. Red's body tightened. What a bloody fool he had been, biding his time, waiting for Mary Jane to tire of his workhorse of a brother. What kind of life was that for the beautiful girl he wanted so badly it hurt? And you'll all live happily ever after in Liverpool? Red's voice was dull and flat, and he gave another scornful half-laugh. It's not what we planned, Paddy answered, enraging him even more. Some men didn't know how lucky they were. Red, walking beside Paddy, hands in pockets, resented his brother more than he had ever done. Good fellow, well-liked, always doing the right thing, always rubbing my nose in it. The back of Red's throat curled. You'll have to work the farm. Stay away from the rebels. Paddy threw the words over his shoulder. Make something of yourself. Hurry now, we don't have much time. His voice went on and on and on, until the mist that gave Red his colourful sobriquet descended. Chapter 1. Cashlery, July 1921. Run, Mary Jane! Run like the wind! Don't look back! 21-year-old Mary Jane Starling turned instinctively, her feet moving faster. She had wings on her sturdy heels as Red pulled her from the edge of the Castletown River that flowed into Dundalk Bay on the east coast of Ireland. She had been expecting to meet Paddy. Something was wrong. Every nerve in her body screaming, instinctively knowing she should not ask. But still, she asked the question. "Red, what is it?" She kept pace with his rapid strides, her heart pounding. "Where's Paddy?" "We've got to get out of here before they see us," Red gasped, dragging her further up the hill. Mary Jane was wary. Red had not the same temperament as his mild-mannered brother. "Who? The Black and Tans?" She knew Red liked a bit of excitement and was mixed up with people who had strong opinions and acted upon them. He was always up to something. It was only a matter of time before his antics caught up with him. "No, not the Black and Tans," Red spat. "Your brothers. They're after skull-dragging our Paddy." His twin brother marrying Mary Jane, not even giving his predicament a second thought, had been the last straw for Red. "Jesus!" Mary Jane gasped. "What did they do that for?" Her three brothers, although fiercely protective of her, were in different stages of becoming doctors, like her deceased parents, and were accustomed to heal, not harm. Barely able to breathe, she kept running, trying to heave air into her lungs. Everybody in the small village of Catlery knew her highly regarded brothers, and this action was out of character for any of them. But she didn't have time to think straight. Everything was moving so fast. Her heart hit her ribs like the bullets from the vicar's machine gun Red had secreted in his family's barn after coming back from the trenches. When they reached the top of the hill, they flopped down, breathless, and Mary Jane's delicate stomach turned in disgust when she saw Red hawk thick mucus from the back of his throat and spit it onto the grass. After a few silent minutes, her breathing calmed. There were so many questions going round in her head. She could hardly make sense of them all. "We told nobody of our plans," Mary Jane said eventually. "The priest's housekeeper could have told someone," Red sneered. "Castlereagh's a small village. It wouldn't take long for word to get out." Mary Jane's heart sank. Looking to her trembling hands, she knew the left one was the wrong side of a wedding ring. Paddy had her gold band in the jacket pocket of his only suit. He was going to make an honest woman of her. Red, quiet, his eyes lowered, avoiding her questioning gaze, new dread weighed heavily on Mary Jane's slim shoulders, and he was glad she was afraid. It would make things easier. "Something bad has happened." There was a quiver in her voice when she spoke. "Tell me, Red." Terrified, her voice rose. "Where is he?" Hugging his knees to his chest, Red blew out his cheeks, looking out over the patchwork fields below. Choosing his words carefully, he eventually lifted his head to answer. They left him for dead, Mary Jane." His stilted words were little more than a whisper. "Paddy's dead." "No!" She bit back a scream. "My brothers?" She watched involuntarily as blood dribbled down his forehead to mingle with the tears running down his cheeks. "It's not safe for you here," Red cut in quickly. Standing up, he reached for her hand. "I've got to get you to Liverpool. They'll come after you next." "He attacked you too?" Mary Jane registered the deep, open gash in his forehead. "Never mind that. We can't stop." He pulled her to her feet, and Mary Jane disregarded the mud that splashed her loose, pale blue coat, fastened at the hip with a single button, which she had bought specially for her wedding day. Nor did she notice the damage to her silk stockings from the gorse bushes that gouged her legs. She felt nothing but fear twisting her insides. Paddy was dead. Paddy was... "But how?" she gasped, holding on to her pale blue cloche hat with its white silk, eye-level daisy, her eyes darting over her shoulder, keeping a lookout for any sign of her brothers. "Why is he dead?" "I don't know," Red lied, gripping her hand tighter. They came after him. We were meeting at the church. We were to be married, taking the night ferry. Aye. Red's tone was shaky. Well, that's not going to happen. Paddy had fought well enough, but even he could not withstand the heavy cobble to the back of his head. Red flinched, but could not dwell. Come on now, keep up. His voice came out in short bursts. They caught him on the low road. He lied, looking back, pulling her over bracken and lumpy turf. She stumbled, but Red would not allow her to slow down. He had to get away from here, away from Dinny O'Mara, away from what he'd done. We must go to him. Mary Jane's voice was urgent, her eyes wide, stark against the insipid pallor of her skin as tears ran freely down her cheeks. Why would you leave your twin brother on the road like that? They were running so fast, she feared for her unborn child. Red stopped suddenly, looking deep into her haunting pale green eyes, and said slowly, as if talking to a child, He's not there any more, Mary Jane. There's nothing we can do for him. O'Hanlon took him. O'Hanlon? The undertaker? Mary Jane tried to pull her hands free, but Red was too strong. We have to get away. We don't have long. Paddy wanted me to help you. They were his last words. Mary Jane fumbled in her pocket. I've got these, she gasped, taking 2 boat tickets from her coat pocket and handing them to Red. But something told her not to mention the money Paddy had added to her savings, the money that would set them up when they got to Liverpool. She had heard about Red's reckless reputation and was wary. Paddy was the quiet one of the Redfern brothers, gentle and kind, whereas Red was a seditious rabble-rouser, the life and soul of the party until his money ran out. I'm scared. Come on. Red's whisper had an urgency she had never heard before. I'll make it better. He could not allow her to ask questions. In time, she would come to love him, the way she had loved Paddy. Until then, there was always Sissy. Red, Mary Jane's voice trembled. I'm going to have Paddy's baby. The silence went on forever, hanging heavy in the stillness of the hot summer air. There was not even the gentle sigh of a breeze, nor the chirrup of birdsong. The news hit him like a kick in the guts. His brows furrowed in a tight pleat that made his head hurt, and he did not trust himself to speak immediately. He recalled Paddy prattling about something back at the farm, but he wasn't listening, his mind concentrating on getting the money he owed to Dinny O'Mara. But to hear this now, from Mary Jane, his upper lip curled. Mary Jane's inside shrunk when she noticed the muscle in Red's jaw twitch, the disgust in his narrowed eyes plainly obvious. The same expression she imagined, not only of her brothers, but on the face of everyone in Cashel. I'm going to have a baby. Her eyes were downcast. That's why the wedding had to be quiet, so my brothers didn't find out. Her brothers were not violent men, but they were protective of her. There was no telling what they would do about her shame, but she hadn't expected them to hurt Paddy, kill him. Bloody idiot! Red's lips drew back in a snarl. They will burn our farm to the ground for this. Then they'll come after you. Have no doubt about that. And when they do, God help you, Mary Jane. She let out a low, terrified whimper. She had lost her man. Her brothers would come looking for her. Mary Jane looked to Red, knowing he had always been jealous of Paddy. She shook her head, throwing off an improbable thought. They were twins, for heaven's sake. Nevertheless, she found it just as difficult to believe her brothers would do such a thing either. Her thoughts were in turmoil. She would be hunted like an animal by the men who had raised and protected her. They would not shield her now. In all her 21 years, she had never known terror like this. She had no choice but to leave her homeland, escape the humiliation. In Liverpool, she would be anonymous. That child you're carrying won't stand a chance when they catch up with you." Red wanted her to feel the blast of shock that he had felt. He wanted to hurt her with words, if nothing else. "You'll be lucky to hear it. They'll go for you first, and then the baby. You mark my words, Mary Jane, they will." "Oh, Red," Mary Jane whimpered, the shock making her thoughts fly in all directions. "I've got to get to the port of Dundalk to catch the boat. You have to help me for Paddy's sake." "I'll take you to Liverpool, on the night boat. We'll make it easily," Red said, not looking at her. "It's my duty to my brother, and I can't fight 3 of yours." He knew her brothers were feared and respected in equal measure on both sides of the Irish border. He also knew they were proud men who would exact revenge for his twin brother's lust, but they were not killers. "Your head's bleeding again. It needs stitches," Mary Jane said, thinking how brave Red was to help her after all he had been through. Red could not look at Mary Jane, and taking a blood-stained rag from his pocket, he dabbed his forehead. Swallowing hard, his mouth dry, he relived the walk to the church in his head. "Paddy, you should have taken the rock from my hand, slapped some sense into me. You should not have turned your back on me." Chapter 2. Liverpool, July 1921. "Just hold on 1 minute, will you?" Mary Jane held on to her cloche hat as a welcoming stiff breeze rolled off the River Mersey from the Irish Sea. Red was craning his neck in search of the man whose hooch he had been sharing all night on the journey over, and Mary Jane wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life, allowing Red to persuade her she needed a guardian to come to such a huge place as Liverpool. Ireland was not the safest place to raise a child right now. The clashes between the north and south of her homeland had resulted in many deaths. And Mary Jane, unmarried by a hair's breadth, was determined she would honour Paddy's memory by making sure she kept his baby safe. Standing tall, her chin high and her back straight, Mary Jane held her ground as a rush of people, eager to get to their destination, barged past her as she stepped off the boat. Exhausted through lack of sleep on the trip across the Irish Sea, she was on the verge of losing her patience with Red, who had proved himself useless as a chaperone and suspected his good deed to his brother was not entirely selfless. "They're like these blasted blue bottles, noisy and annoying." Red, keeping his eyes peeled for his drinking companion, took off his cap. "Ah, Jesus, I need a drink." "Oh, so you can speak? I began to wonder." Mary Jane's lips puckered in disdain. All he'd done since stepping on the boat at Dundalk was huddle in whispering conversations with men he knew back home. Standing on the quayside, Mary Jane felt an unsettling heaviness in her chest and fought hard to hold on to the meagre contents of her stomach. But it wasn't the crossing that had made her feel queasy. Her morning sickness lasted all day. "I will get you settled, Mary Jane. It is the least I can do. You have nobody to support you except me." Red drove the message home to her that without him, she would be at the mercy of every man who looked her way. Her trusting nature, no, her stupidity, had brought her to this. Her only hope of escaping her brothers was to depend on Red. She had never felt so alone, so helpless. "Paddy has a house waiting for us in Walton," she said, clutching the heavy carpet bag, her only luggage, which she had packed before setting off to meet Paddy, and had briefly returned to the house to get it before going to the port with Red. "I doubt that will happen now, Mary Jane," said Red. "Houses in Walton don't come cheap, and Paddy would haunt me if I didn't look after you properly." Mary Jane opened her mouth to speak, but Red cut off her words, obviously loving the sound of his own voice. "I know of another place. Paddy would approve." He never took his eyes off the moving crowd. "He was more than a brother. He was the other half of me. We started life together 9 months before we entered the world. Him first, then me. But he trusted my judgment, always." "Don't flatter yourself, Red," she said, having had a long time to think about the terrible situation she now found herself in, Her tongue was sharp. "You're as slippery as a sack of snakes. Paddy wouldn't trust you to care for a one-eyed cat." "I know of a place in Beamer Street," he said, ignoring her acid retort. "You'll love it." Close to tears, the heat in the crowd were already testing Mary Jane's resilience. Liverpool was supposed to be their lifeline, hers and Paddy's, set them up to give their unborn child the best life. They had dreams of owning their own business. Paddy decided she would work out of sight while he was out front, selling the delicious pies and bread she loved to bake, maybe even opening a tea shop. They would do it together, for hadn't she been the best cook and baker in Cashlery? Everybody said so. But her dreams had come crashing down around her when she found out he was dead. This should have been the first day of her married life with the man she loved. How did it all go so tragically wrong? "You've the child to think about now, Mary Jane." Red scowled, tapping his foot and craning his head over the large crowd. Her nostrils flared. She did not need him to tell her about her obligations. Seeming to spot someone, he moved away from her. She was determined to make a new life for herself and her child. She had given no thought to getting rid of her unborn child, nor did she consider giving it away when it was born. She took a deep breath of scorching air with a determination born from keeping 3 strapping brothers in line after her parents were killed on Titanic's maiden voyage, knowing this was her mess and she would clean it up. While she had a tongue in her head and strength in her fingers, she would do what she and Paddy had set out to do, bake and sell pies and bread, and one day, no matter how long it took, she would have her own shop. Realising that Red was no longer beside her, she looked around and caught sight of him talking to a man he had met on the boat. They'd huddled together most of the way here, whispering and plotting. Mary Jane's shoulders dropped. She had no interest in what Red got up to, deciding it was better not to know. But she did not like to be cast aside like something that was of no further use. He had persuaded her he would look out for her, but when he got on the boat he had barely spoken 2 words to her, playing cards and drinking with the others. Now Mary Jane found herself standing alone in the blazing sunshine at Liverpool Docks, not knowing which way to turn. Her eyes scanned the quayside. The tea shop across the way looked inviting, and she longed for a little shade. The sun was high in the blue sky that matched her wedding outfit. Parched, Mary Jane knew it had been hours since she'd had a cup of tea, and her mouth felt like the bottom of Marley's well, which had dried up years ago. The need to sit down was overwhelming, as the overpowering reek of oil and smoke pervaded her senses, making her stomach lurch, homesick for that crisp apple scent of the green patchwork fields back home. She could not help but notice the tired-looking women carrying their young on their hip, coddled in sweltering black shawls, while others flicked flies from baskets of fish and barrows of fruit at the roadside. Some were begging from people who looked as if they had little to give. Mary Jane wanted no part of that. She had worked since she could walk. She wasn't destitute, having her own and Paddy's savings secreted under her heel in her elegant black leather shoe, with its single bar and tapering toe, after which she was sure her mother had named her. Mary Jane had always been a saver, beavering away every spare penny for her future. She would need to make her own way, depend on nobody except herself, and that day had come. Red was now lost in the crowd, nowhere to be seen, as a sun-baked woman, looking older than Methuselah's mother, brushed past her and silently held out her hand. Mary Jane took 2 pennies from her pocket and placed them in the grubby palm of the old woman's hand. "May God bless you and keep you clean," she said. "I can see trouble ahead for you, but the good Lord gave you strong shoulders to carry your burden, and you will be sorely tested. But listen to me when I tell you this. One day you will know the truth, and as one life ends, so your life will begin." "I don't believe in such things," Mary Jane said. Her family were doctors, scientists, educated people who did not hold with such nonsense. Life was what you made it, not ruled by a chance encounter. "All I want," Mary Jane told the old crone, "is a bit of peace and a sit down." Paddy, the only man she had ever loved, was dead, and to make matters worse, Red seemed to think he was going to step into his brother's shoes. Well, she thought, he could think again. As soon as she was settled, he could take the next boat out of here. Heading towards the tea shop, she stopped momentarily to look up to the magnificent clock towers of the 10-year-old Liver building she had read so much about from borrowed library books, wanting to know everything about what was to be their new hometown. Atop each tower were two mythical birds, which Paddy had told her about, one looking into the city to protect its people, and the other looking out to sea to protect the sailors. Well, that may be the case, Mary Jane thought, looking through the herd of people and still seeing no sign of Red, and she knew for certain she could rely only on herself to protect her and her unborn child. "Look out, lady!" a deep male voice called over the perpetual motion of the dockside, and Mary Jane jumped back, losing her hat in the process as the mass of sweaty bodies closed in. Coming from a rural village, she had never seen so many people. There were hundreds of them, all rushing around like ants in the scorching heat, determined to get to their destination. "You need to be more careful, ma'am. You could get hurt," he called from his lofty perch. Shading her eyes with her hand, she looked up to see a man dressed in a long tan-coloured coat, driving his horse and cart along the jetty. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said, retrieving her hat. "You almost ran me over." Paddy had persuaded her this busy port city was the place to be, explaining they could make a good living here. But she never expected to be run down for her trouble. She suspected she would have to be up before dawn and out before breakfast to keep up with this lot. She was still a little disconcerted when he raised his battered leather fedora in silent regard, and Mary Jane knew if she was ever to survive this busy dockside, she would have to be tougher than most. Cal Everdine pulled his horse's reins, barely missing the girl in the loose-fitting coat, who almost walked under the hooves of his bay mare, too busy looking up to the clock of the Liver building. In her rush to get onto the sidewalk, her hat flew off, and her russet-coloured hair tumbled and glinted in the sunshine. The young woman glared at him with startling absinthe-coloured eyes, as if the near collision was his fault, and he had no right to be on her road. As she bent to pick up her hat, he noticed she lost the flower, but she was so intent on giving him a look that would have slayed a lesser man, she didn't even notice. He had one last delivery to make, and he did not want to spend it in the infirmary with this young woman who could not watch where she was going. All he wanted to do was get home, have a long soak and try to cool down. She was a feisty one, with a spirit he could not help but admire. And going by the scathing look she gave to the curly-haired man in the flat cap, Cal could see there was no love lost on her part. He shook his head in wonder as he saw her grip an overstuffed carpet bag and head for the tea shop. Chapter 3. Mary Jane approached the tea shop door, vowing she would not stay on this filthy dockside any longer than was absolutely necessary. She heard Red's familiar whistle cutting through the throng, and against her better judgment she turned to see him, pushing his flat cap to the back of his head, and waited until he drew near. When he reached her, he leaned in, his words low and precise. "Now listen, Mary Jane," he said as if talking to a 5-year-old. Not a word of apology for leaving her standing like an idiot on the jetty, she noticed. "You go and have a nice cup of tea, and I'll be back before you even know I've gone." "Gone where?" Mary Jane's voice sounded calm enough, but she had no idea where she was or where she should go. I will fix everything, Red replied, causing Mary Jane to raise a sceptical brow. That'll make a change, because up to now you've fixed nothing. Her next word shot out of her mouth like a bullet from a gun. I can't wait to see what kind of pig's ear you'll make of anything. Turning on her elegant heel, she made her way toward the tea shop. I won't be long, Red followed her, trying to make her understand. I'll be right back. Don't give it another thought, she said defiantly, even though she felt a million butterflies had been let loose inside her. I'm sure I can find my own way from here. Trust me, Mary Jane. Red took a deep breath and held onto her arm. His words hushed, like he was at mass. She could tell he was trying to reassure her. I have to meet somebody. He was silent for a moment, as if thinking. I cannot understand why Paddy would leave you with no money. It's not your place to understand. Mary Jane's voice held no expression. She had no intention of letting Red know she had money which Paddy had given her the last time she saw him, so he wouldn't be tempted to lend it to Red. She should never have trusted a word Red said. He had a reputation for being devious, always looking out for himself. But a woman travelling alone was an easy target, and she must protect her belongings with every weapon in her armoury. Who are you meeting? Mary Jane asked. It was none of her business, of course, but she asked all the same. Never mind who. Red sounded impatient, looking over his shoulder. He thrust a slip of crumpled paper into her hand. If I'm not back in half an hour, go and meet me here. Opening a crudely drawn map that showed a large X in the centre, she asked, Where's this? Pointing to the cross. The cross is the town hall, Red explained, poking the paper. If I'm not back, don't forget, meet me there. Will you do that, Mary Jane? He sounded eager for her to agree, and she reluctantly nodded her head. Good girl, now go and have a nice cup of tea and we'll be settled into Bemis Street before you know it. I will be settled. You are not invited, she said tersely. Then glancing in his direction, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, Your head's bleeding again. Red dabbed his head. Giving a cursory glance to his blood-stained fingertips, he wiped them on the seat of his corduroy trousers before brushing the wound with his cuff. Don't forget, half an hour, he called over his shoulder, weaving through the crowds. In seconds he was gone. Fear of the unknown weighed heavily, and Mary took a deep breath, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. She had to move along. Standing here getting baked by the hot sun was doing her no good at all. Nor did she have any intentions of wallowing or crying her eyes out like a child who'd lost its mammy, no matter how much she longed to do that very thing. Red was a shifty reprobate, and she felt unusually vulnerable without him. He had warned her about the tricksters who cheated gullible people from their possessions. The sharpers, he called them, men who stole your belongings the minute you took your eye off them. Gripping the battered carpet bag, she stepped inside the tea room, packed with people of every shape and size, and almost ran back out again when she was met by a thick shroud of cigarette smoke. The smell of fried food, mixing with the whiff of grimy travellers, caused the familiar tingle at the hinge of her jaw as her mouth filled with saliva. Don't throw up here, she silently pleaded, swallowing over and over, unable to turn and flee, forced into the tea shop by a group of people behind her, urging her forward. Just tea? The waitress asked, when Mary Jane reached the front of the queue, and she nodded, watching the girl pour strong, dark tea from a huge teapot along the line of 6 cups resting on a grid, knowing this delivery probably saved time as the queue of people behind her grew. No milk for me, Mary Jane said, and the girl sighed before fetching another cup. The tea room was packed with travellers waiting to board their ship, but she spied an empty table by the window, praying nobody got there first. Her prayer was answered when she managed to sit down. She put her carpet bag on the table, sighed, and took out the sheet of paper which Red had given her. Mary Jane wanted to study it in detail. Not that there was much to study. The X was next to an address. 43 Beamer Street. "Excuse me," she asked a passing waitress. "Do you know where this address is, please?" "Let me have a look," said the young waitress, who Mary Jane guessed was about 16 or 17, and wore her white frilled cap at a jaunty angle over raven black shingled hair. Her dark calf-length dress was covered with a white apron. She smiled as she took the crumpled sheet of paper. The first friendly face Mary Jane had met. She didn't have long to wait for an answer. "Beamer Street? Fancy that," said the waitress, her smile widening. "I'm Daisy Hayward. I live next door, number 45, with my mum and my brothers and sister." She gave no indication of where it was until she passed the paper back to Mary Jane. "It's off the main dock road. Big families, mostly Irish, friendly enough. Well, some are, but there's good and bad everywhere, I suppose." She lowered her voice and said in a conspiratorial tone, "The houses on our side once belonged to professionals. Doctors, solicitors, bank managers, you know. The hoity-toity." She laughed, in no hurry to move away. "Number 43 is a lodging house these days, run by Sissy Stone, for Irish navvies who come over to work on the docks. Are you taking up a position there?" Mary Jane shook her head, and the waitress gave her another nod. "You want to watch the landlady?" Daisy said in a friendly whisper, then stopped suddenly, a look of alarm clouding her eyes. "She's not a relation, is she?" "No, she's not a relation," Mary Jane said, suppressing a smile. Daisy seemed to be one of those people who spoke first and thought later, but she didn't see any malice in the girl. In fact, Mary Jane liked this girl called Daisy, whose plain speaking was refreshing after Red's cryptic instructions. "Some of the townhouses got turned into lodgings, respectable ones, mind," Daisy said in that friendly way of most waitresses. "Cheap enough, but you need a letter from the Holy Ghost to get one of them. The houses on the other side of Beamer Street are smaller, groups of 4 with a shop on every corner." "Thank you, that's good to know," Mary Jane answered. She wondered how on earth Red had managed to bag such a sought-after place like Beamer Street, at a time when, it was rumoured, whole swathes of her fellow countrymen existed on little more than bread, dripping, and sweet milky tea in cramped courts along the dock road. Daisy was called away by a customer. "I'm sure we'll see each other in passing." Mary Jane nodded. Usually she would have been full of questions and would have loved to pass the time of day, but not today. She had too much to think about. Looking out of the window, she saw a man selling matches on the dockside. He had a chest full of medals and one sleeve pinned where his arm should have been. This country was still recovering from the impoverishing effects of the Great War, she thought, 3 years after it ended. She felt sorry for the brave soldier who had given up his chance of making a decent living and had put his life in danger for his country. And what did he receive in return? A chance to stand on a sun-drenched quayside, hoping his matches didn't burst into flames in the heat. Jobs were scarce, but better than back home. It was obvious the man over yonder had to do what he could. Moving the carpet bag off the table and placing it on the floor beside her chair, Mary Jane knew she would have to keep an eye on her mother's clock, which was inside it. It was worth a lot of money, but that wasn't the reason she had wanted it. The clock was her security. She suspected Red would leave her stranded and